Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Institute of Virtual Lunch and Learn series. Very excited to bring you two panelists today to talk about all things virtual events and early experiences. I'm joined today by Dax Callner and Sarah Sharif. Guys, welcome to the show. Really excited to have you here and to learn about your experiences. Love to first start off with an introduction, just give everybody a little bit of perspective as to what you guys have experienced and what your perspective is. Sarah, can I start with you?
Yeah, no, of course. So hi, everyone, founder of Experimental Civics. We're an innovation institute and consultancy, and we were running a global hackathon for the climate crisis earlier this year in June. So of course, we faced the brunt of having to pivot our entire in-person event to virtual. But happy to talk more about it during this call.
Awesome. Very excited to learn more. I was telling Sarah before we started going, I heard about you guys making that pivot early, and here we are sometime later. So excited to hear a little bit more about that. And Dax, your background, production, events, tell us a little bit about the perspective you share.
Well, I've been in this business a long time. I started at Jack Morton Worldwide in 1999. Sure. Oh, yes. It's now 2020. Yes, we can do the math. Interestingly, I started as in digital was my first role in an events agency. I'd never worked in events, but I started working at this events agency in a digital capacity, and then moved from digital production, which is where I started, into strategy. And I've been doing strategy ever since, from Jack Morton to Momentum, to Publicis, to Sparks, to GES. And now, despite my accent in the United Kingdom, I'm the strategy director at Smyle, which is an events agency, digital and physical experience events now in the UK.
Very cool. Awesome. Sarah, let's start with you. You guys had to make this pivot. You had this hackathon meant to be an in-person event. Obviously, a lot of team building, I would imagine, that goes on, and a lot of bouncing ideas off of each other in that kind of environment. How do you make the pivot? Give us that story, that 30,000-foot overview of what do you guys do to make that change and go virtual? When everyone's rushing to Zoom, did you guys go Zoom, or did you guys go to a platform? Talk to us about the experience.
Yeah, so kind of starting with what the event originally was. So we were going to be a Guinness World Record event hosted in Austin, Texas, and international guests from all over the world. It was meant to be a 2-day conference and hackathon where we would have keynote speakers and music performances and art installations on site, in addition to having our participants actually build startup models and business models for the climate crisis. Mm-hmm. So as you can imagine, in March, it was a huge swing to, we had sponsorships in play, we had partnerships from all over the world. So to switch into an entirely new format required a lot of a lot of effort, a lot of sleepless nights with myself and the team, but had an excellent team behind me. But our rationale was really at that point in time, one, for morale, so keeping spirits up as the world was going through this huge shift, and knowing that we wanted to kind of take our ship and steer it right into the hurricane and come up with some solution as innovators ourselves
Sure.
for what we could offer. But really, it was about, when you talked about Zoom, we did over a week of really intense platform analysis. We actually looked at a lot of beta models that other entrepreneurs in the video streaming, production, streaming event space, who were these people?
Sure.
And coming up with something that was a little bit more nimble and flexible for us, also from a price point standpoint. That was a big thing of just budget. What is the budget for a digital production versus all the expenses that we had in the in-person event? But really coming back to, and I could talk about this more later, but the essence of what we were offering, right? That experience was a gathering. Could we still offer participants or sponsors, stakeholders, partners, that gathering feel of everyone coming together, sharing knowledge, building projects, and moving things forward, which we were able to accomplish. But it was kind of analyzing, what are we trying to do? And then having the platform and all the features kind of just fall under that umbrella. But getting that North Star right took us about 4 or 5 weeks.
Yeah, it's interesting. I love the answer because you had to figure out what were you guys aiming to do. You didn't start with the platform and say, what can we do? You said, what do we want to do and how do we tackle it? I've heard of many going the opposite direction, which often strikes me as not the right approach. So I think, but these are all the early lessons. So I think you guys had the right idea to find that North Star. Dax, how does strategy evolve as you worked with clients and as you observed people transitioning what would have been traditional events into the online world? And how did you navigate those waters? Because there's just different components to these kinds of experiences.
Yeah. First I will say I want to compliment Sarah because I think using the word participants is such a better term than delegates or attendees or users, which is the worst, I think, when it comes to virtual events, because they're not users, they're in it, they should be active. So I'm trying to use that same terminology and get it into our language. So I really do just want to appreciate that. Let me just tell the story a little bit of what happened with us. We're an events agency and we have always done, like, I've been with Smyle 2 years, but even before I was there were virtual elements. We would stream content from an EY or an NBC panel for an online audience. So we had some experience in the kind of like streaming or broadcast part of what would be now part of a virtual event. When events started to get canceled in February of this year, we had a conversation and we had a choice to make. The choice was to go dark pretty much and wait it out, or to do something different. And we decided to embrace innovation and digital and see what we could figure out in terms of this space. And like Sarah said, and like as you just said, we didn't start with what platform should we align to. We started by thinking about what are our clients' goals and objectives and what will make an audience experience really compelling. We're like anti-webinar, for example. Webinars serve their purpose. We're kind of like on a sort of a webinar now. That's fine. They serve a purpose.
100%.
But a webinar is not an event in the way that we think of one. What are the attributes of what makes an event worth attending? And how do we bring those into virtual? The most basic and obvious answers: content. The content has got to be excellent. It's got to be worth spending time with. And it has to work in digital, which is a bit different than content works in physical, because you have all kinds of distractions. You have people checking their emails, checking their phones. It's not that you can't do that in a physical, you can, but you get my point.
Yes.
Loads more distractions. And also we're all sitting in front of our computers all the time, consuming content. You have to really think about the quality of the messaging and the content. And we try to take a journalistic sensibility to how we approach content with client work. The second is networking or getting people talking, authentic human interaction. So important for a physical event. How do we bring that to life in virtual event settings? That has taken a lot of thought and innovation to deliver some sense of authentic human conversation within a virtual setting. Because we know, I think we all agree, nothing is quite like sitting and talking to someone face to face, but how do we get as close to that as possible or capture some of that magic through virtual? The last thing, and then I'll shut up, is creating effective brand and product interactions. In a sense, if you're talking about a client like ours, Samsung, they have physical products. We have to be super creative about delivering a product experience that is as close to hands-on or interactive as you would in a physical setting, because these people who are their customers and consumers, they need to experience the products before they will make a purchase. So we thought about all of those and we combined, I believe, what works with an event with what works at digital. So rather than trying to replicate physical experiences, we take our lessons from the worlds of online gaming and online shopping and dating sites to bring the best of what works in those kinds of interactions and bring those into the virtual event setting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's so many parts to what you guys both expressed that you did that resonate with why we're exploring where virtual events are going. I mean, you talked about the fact that it's not a webinar. It's a different animal. Yes, they're both consumed potentially on, well, they're both consumed on a device. But beyond that, the differences are dramatic. What kinds of engagements are there or interactions, and how do you curate the content? What's the production value? And to Sarah's point, what's the North Star? What are you trying to accomplish? It's not a glitzy show for the sake of having a glitzy show, but it's trying to translate that traditional into something new. It's not replicating it, because I've spoken with and heard of people that are trying to replicate weeks-long events and do that in the exact manner that they did in the traditional world. I don't necessarily think that translates.
Yeah.
So, Sarah, you guys spoke with a lot of entrepreneurs, you said, about platforms, and you looked at options, and obviously budget played a role in that. And I'm sure, Dax, you guys have experienced the technology side. And I think you both kind of touched on this a little bit, that the technology, I mean, Dax, you said you guys were doing virtual as streaming and those kinds of projects, which, guilty as charged, so was I. But the reality is these are different, right? I mean, this isn't just throwing something up on YouTube, but this is doing something further with that. So, Sarah, how did your team look and address the technology? And then, Dax, I'd be curious about the same. How did you guys figure out what makes sense? I've got to imagine the answer is different for each event. But Sarah, obviously, you guys spent a lot of time, so would love to learn a little bit more about your process to make that right decision.
Yeah, and so, it really came down to how do we maximize this entire experience, but weave in delight every step of the way. So there's no questions, there's no murkiness, there's no, participants aren't just floating around trying to figure out, what do I click on? Where do I go? What's in my email? Did I get the invite? Is it on my calendar? So everything, we took it from a very human-centered approach. Our entire team went through the process of onboarding, for example, on the event. We maximized Squarespace, the website that we're using. I brought in a separate team and hired them on to specifically design things that were custom code and everything to, again, streamline the whole onboarding experience. So for example, if you were coming in as a participant to hack a project, you could see them listed by country, you could see them listed by time zone, you could see them listed by, other information. So, with global participants, so if I'm in the UK, I can see all of the projects and the project leads and who's active, within my time zone. So it was really thinking outside of the box and just ironing out all of those different intricate details, right? So even in Slack, we use Slack as one of our tools. They were amazing. I worked very closely with the team at Slack, so just shout out to them. Thank you. They had released a bunch of beta tools that we were able to access in terms of automation. So reminders. In the reminders, we were able to put links to videos. All of these little hand-holding kind of white glove services that, it's kind of easier to do sometimes in person, we were able to replicate in the virtual world. And that meant that folks weren't wondering or feeling so lost, right? Like there wasn't those kind of emotional triggers or touch points that usually get lost in the mix. We were able to tackle those and really have the whole team be very mindful of where every single person was coming from. So I think that level of intricate detail is, again, lost. To Dax's point, it's more than just throwing a webinar out there. It's recognizing your audience. Who are they? Where in the world are they? What languages do they speak in? We had translators available in 16 different languages in our Slack channel. So it was just being really mindful of, this is for the audience. People come to these events for the people, and just really catering to that at a next level and going above with that mindfulness. So
when you were looking at the technology, it sounds to me like you were perhaps aggregating a bunch of what you felt to be best in breed for each part of the event equation. Is that a fair read on how you guys approached it?
Yeah, so we had a whole and I have to now rack my brain on this. We had several different feature lists. What we were looking for from like a chat feature,
Yes.
option offering versus like the video streaming. We ended up using Google actually for all of our keynotes and artist performances. We use YouTube to do some recordings of like artists at their home in terms of music and live poetry performances as well. So we played with different tools on what worked, but ultimately, our tech stack was using Slack, leveraging Squarespace, and using Google actually as kind of our soundboard for everything, which was very different from what others were doing. And we did take a look at all platforms, even from Uber Conference to Zoom to Cisco WebEx, so many different tools, but really finding what was the integration that was the most seamless for our participants.
Yeah, well, obviously there was such a rush to Zoom, right? I mean, Zoom became synonymous with the pandemic. But, I've heard similar stories to yours, Sarah, that organizations started doing their analysis on platforms, and have done much of that myself as we've worked with clients. But you start to realize that, as you said, you have different feature sets. And I think there's some conversation out there now. Is it going to be a world where there's a one size fits all platform, or will there be different players that you bring together in the way that you guys did? So, I mean, again, your case study and how you guys approached it was quite forward thinking from where most were just jumping on a Zoom chat and having a more of a webinar. Dax, what has your experience been on the technology side, and what are you guys seeing in terms of platform or best in breed and bringing together different solutions?
It's actually not dissimilar to Sarah's journey. The first thing I would say is, if you start with a platform, people who work in physical events, I mean, it's almost like creating an event based on what the venue is. You just wouldn't do that. You would say, what do we need to create? What is the experience we need to create? And then let's find the right venue for the experience that we've designed. We had many discussions about technologies, and we have three different approaches to this. The first is to use existing platforms that are out there. And as you guys have done, we've done robust analysis into platforms. And, I've got all kinds of like this, what are the features of different existing virtual event platforms out there. And at times we work with them. We have to, sometimes the clients dictate, we only use this certain platform. You have to make it work. I'm doing something on Microsoft Teams right now that's just required that the client dictated. But what we have found in our analysis is no one platform does everything that we would like it to do. And so the second angle for us is our own model, which is a bespoke, that's an English word, but a customized approach, which uses a Smyle defined front end, and then, as Sarah said, a stack of technologies behind it that feed into that front end interface. So from an attendee or a participant standpoint, it feels like they're having one cohesive experience, but behind the scenes is the integration of a number of different tools and processes to make sure that experience will work. And so it still uses some off-the-shelf technologies, but there's this integration of them into a cohesive whole. That's the second option for us. The third is to build it ground up. And I don't necessarily mean build it from a coding perspective. For example, we did a project where we built the event using Unreal Engine, which is a gaming software. So we created an online, virtual event experience, but we did it as if we were building a video game. And in it was products and talks and interactions. And that was a much more deep kind of initiative for us to work on. But it was very interesting to start from scratch and say, how do we use a coding system and build something that's never existed before? There is no off the shelf. It's all done from scratch. And so we've done all three of those models, and I think that there are pros and cons and cost considerations to all of them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And Sarah, you mentioned earlier, sort of in your analysis that budget played a role, and you guys looked at feature sets and what the budget constraints were. And to your illustration, Dax, I mean, there's so many different ways to go about doing this. It's really interesting. And Sarah, kind of goes to what you guys were doing in a sense at the hackathon. I mean, is to see the innovation that's going to come out of this. And what I'm hearing you guys say is not only because we often look at it as the innovation on the platform side, but what I'm hearing you guys say too is that there's going to be that technology stack on the backside. And we're really going to kind of create new opportunities for front end interfaces, but also behind the scenes, and kind of figuring out what are the right tools for each project. Because, I know you mentioned, Sarah, chat. Some projects may require that and others may not, but they may require something else other than chat. So is that the way that you guys see it going? Sarah, when you guys start thinking about 2021, do you start thinking in terms of continuing in that stack model? Was that a successful play for you?
Yeah, that is a great question. And, I think there's kind of two things I'll add is one, back to what we've already talked about, is having really dynamic content. So how you're even running your panels, how you're having your keynote discussions. We talked about the chat feature, but again, that weaves in the delight, right? There has to be more interactive ways, right? Whether it is avatars or it is going into a video game setting virtually, right? Like there's going to be, I think, more creativity that we'll see from there. But I think in terms of this tech stack as well, even from a production lens, we're a team of between 12 and 19 folks. So we had, up to 3 or 4 people per session. This is not a one person runs everything, right? You've got the person on the back end with the speakers and camera angles, and then you've got your stage check and, all the same things that go into a live production experience, just moving that over and having a virtual production team. So I can certainly see more tools being built just on the back end for how do you schedule those shifts? How do you do your pre-checks, making sure that everyone is muted or has the right mic, or even audio levels, right? I think we've all been on some great and maybe some, webinars or sessions that need improvement. And so it's kind of ironing out, again, all of those different tweaks that go on with how do you actually run a seamless virtual event. And again, thinking about those tools and details that can help alleviate those problems.
You make such a good point too. I mean, and Dax said earlier, it's like we're on a webinar here, and in a sense, that is what this is. This isn't a highly polished production. Being a production guy, it drives me nuts. But at the end of the day, it's about getting the information out, which is what I think this vehicle is good for. But you make an important point about the teams, and that it's a team approach, and it's not a singular person. And in a sense, I think it almost takes more people perhaps to run a successful virtual event because everything is virtual, and it takes more attention to detail and rehearsals. Has that been kind of what you guys have found, Dax?
I mean, I'll say 2 things based on this interesting conversation. One is that what we have found is there's an expectation that it's easier and cheaper to work in virtual, and it may be less expensive in some areas and more in others, but the easier bit is we've had a real interesting lesson in that this year, and that is when you're doing digital development, if you make a change, if you change something in the code or something in the experience, it has a knock-on effect to everything else. It's much different than a physical event team that's accustomed to, I can move this wall or this sign or this chair. It doesn't impact everything else that you're working on.
Right.
And so what we have found is from a process standpoint, we have to lock things down and keep them pretty locked much earlier than you would for physical. And so that's a serious change in process that is required. And the other thing I will say is, this year there's been a rush to virtual events. And I don't think personally that's going to go away. I don't think we're going to, even when the pandemic recedes and vaccines happen, I think that that there will be a different way that events take place in the future, and they will have a serious digital element. So I think for everyone listening, I wouldn't imagine that virtual is going to go away. But the other thing on it is, in a way, we're like teenagers in this. This is not a mature area. We are experimenting. We're making mistakes.
Yes.
We're hopefully learning from those mistakes.
Hopefully.
And I think there will be a maturation that happens over the next few years where we will kind of really get this nailed, and the innovation that we're doing now will become more of the way of doing things versus us all trying new stuff. And so that's kind of how I look at where we are in this journey.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's one of the things that we love about this is that we're getting to define a whole industry here. I mean, you mentioned it. It's a fact that virtual existed before the pandemic. It was out there, but it was secondary. It was something. It was a nice to have. It was maybe the bigger brands would add it. It was additive, but it wasn't core. And now it's become core for everybody, and it's got to be core for everybody across a range of budgets and goals and different North Stars that they're following, like Sarah. So yeah, I think that there's so much to be learned here, and we're getting to really kind of define it. So speaking of that, I often say we learn more from our failures than our successes. We learn from both. But you guys have both been through the weeds a little bit. Can I ask you to reveal a battle wound? What's been a failure and a lesson learned? And I'll leave it up to whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I'll do this. This is,
all right. I knew someone would.
How am I going to say this? I don't want to say specifically who the client or project was. And I think what happened was, if I'm honest with you, we entered into a project and we were too ambitious. We wanted to accomplish too much, and we didn't realize how complex the solution was that we were trying to accomplish. And it had to do with a very large event across multiple time zones and having a lot of networking and conversation between people. And at the end of the day, very close to the delivery of the event, we had to change what was going to happen at the event because we just weren't ready. The code wasn't ready. We were too aggressive, too ambitious, and even the client was too ambitious with us. Like we all embarked on this journey and thought, we're going to do something that's never been done before. We did do some things at that event that had never been done, I'm proud to say, but we also had to pull things out at the last minute that was a huge disappointment and a huge learning for us, for again, how long it takes, how many people are required, and just, I guess, setting the right expectations about what is possible within the time and budget that you've got. And I think, again, we just tried to swallow way too much.
I think that's probably a common theme, and time and budget drive so much of what people are trying to accomplish, but yet it's an unknown as to how much time do things take and how much budget does it require given whatever the feature set might be. So I appreciate sharing that, because it's something I think we're all patching our wounds and trying to figure out how to move forward and understand these things better. Sarah, what did you guys learn going through your first virtual and doing so at such an early time in this virtual event space?
Yeah, I think, two things, same attitude of being overly ambitious. I felt like one lesson learned was with live stream and virtual events, we have this, maybe this perception, because it isn't in person, that you can almost overpack your schedule. So there was one moment where I think I had like 2 keynotes going and like a panel on the side, and just trying to like be there with the teams to kind of manage the transitions between all. So we had a fully packed schedule. So if anything, it was learning how to do buffer, because buffer comes naturally when you have a stage, right? Like you're doing a step behind and you have your speakers coming on, and then you have break times already built in. So I think the virtual pacing of how do you actually host a virtual conference and how to pace it for participants as well was a lesson learned. And I think the other thing was back to that global offering. We were not fully polished with how to host this global international event and really being mindful of all the time zones. We tried our best. Now, definitely going into events in 2021, I have a clearer understanding of really how to do it in a way that does not drive all the teams crazy, so no one's up at 3 a.m., for example. But that was just something we suffered through for our event. But just being very mindful of how you structure that.
Yeah. And also, you went from an event that would typically happen in Austin, everybody would congregate there. Now you put on this virtual event and it became global. Did you see an increase in participation, I would imagine?
Our numbers definitely shifted, but yes, we had over 31 countries represented, which was wonderful.
Wow.
So at least we were able to kind of hold true to what we had promised, the folks attending. So
very cool. Very cool. All right. I know we're getting tight on time here and I want to wrap up in a few minutes, but I want to also, I asked you about your failures. What's a success? Obviously, we've all done things that we're proud of in these last couple of months as we've all pivoted. So Sarah, what was something your team was really proud of after the event, something that you want to build on in the future?
Yeah, I think the two things that I would definitely encourage folks to really be mindful of and think about events in the future is length. We had amazing prep with all the panelists, keynote speakers, art performance, guests prior to the event. So keeping your length short, so none of our panels were longer than 30 minutes. Nothing, I think, at the event was longer than 30. Just being, again, very mindful that no one really wants to sit down for 2 hours and listen to like a full discussion on certain things. So being very mindful of length, I think we did a great job there. And that also kept it very high energy. So making sure that on Slack, we were posting memes and weird questions and talking about COVID and, almost talking about the elephant in the room. I think it was a great place, again, to be a space of gathering virtually where people could talk about what they were going through. So I think, bringing again that human element, we're all in this weird journey together, but weaving that into your events and not denying it or ignoring it. But again, people come to events for people. So however you can build up that interaction. I won't name the conference, but I did attend something 3-4 weeks ago and there was no live chat. And it was the most dry conference because no one really wants to sit and just come for live stream content, right? You go because you want to meet people. So being very mindful of, I think what we did successfully is length, keep it short, keep it high energy, but focus on the people.
So it is the cadence of how your event flows and keeping that human or that humanity element front and center. Those were two lessons for you guys. Mm-hmm. And Dax, what about you guys? What's a proud moment? We won't focus on the negative moment.
I'll mention two examples also, and I'll make it quick. But one is, I talked about content earlier, and this was for a large technology client. It was an internal event, which is why I can't say who it was. It was for their leaders across the company. And one of the benefits to virtual is you getting access to talent and speakers. And because they're coming in from their homes, just like we are today, there's no flights, there's no booking, there's no travel, there's no F&P, there's no hotels, all that stuff. We're able to get better talent than I think we ever were able to before. And we had some incredible, mind-blowing speakers, and the audience just loved the content. And it was just because we had access to a range of people that it would have been much more challenging to get into a physical environment. So in a way, going virtual gave us more opportunity to improve the content than we would have had at a physical event. The next one is a program we worked on with Samsung, I mentioned earlier, where we were able to gamify the whole event experience. So we had a virtual platform, an experience that people would enter into. And within that, we had Easter eggs planted throughout the experience. And if you collected enough Easter eggs, it would transform the whole environment and create this fun, funky space. And just this idea of like, what can you do in digital that you definitely couldn't do in physical? This ability to totally transform the environment and make it a completely different experience based on a few clicks and finding a few fun things. And so I think it's just about like unbound creativity. We have so much we can do with access to digital tools and techniques. Like, let's get away from what the possible has been with physical events, and let's really get innovative and do fresh and creative thinking when we put these programs together.
Yeah, I love that idea because it is an opportunity to do fresh creative thinking to completely reinvent what the event looks like. I mean, it could be something totally different than the traditional. I think we're at the forefront of all this. I really do. I think if we have this conversation in a year from now, it's going to be totally different. As we wrap up, any final thoughts you guys want to share? Any thoughts on where you see this space going and growing?
I'll start if you don't mind. I think,
Absolutely.
There will be a return to physical events. And I think we all have to consider what is the hybrid event model, because I believe that it may be never, but it'll at least be a long time before we get to very large audiences congregating in physical settings. So consider not waiting for a return to physical, but how you can create a dual strategy where you have a virtual or a digital audience, you have a physical audience. I mean, I think that is the future. And as I mentioned earlier, virtual is not going to go away, even when physical events do return. So I would just say to any event planners out there, understand this world, learn digital, don't just wait for physical to return. This is not going away. This is the new way of working.
Very cool. Thank you for the insight. Sarah, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just keep it short and sweet, but to fellow event organizers and folks that have had to make the pivot this year, I think it's us also uniting and supporting each other, sharing knowledge in events like this. I really have seen this beautiful uptick in terms of the community itself. I know we're all attending virtual webinars and things like that in March, trying to figure things out. But the more that we can share knowledge, if you've got a great best practice or you feel like you've uncovered something new, feel free to find avenues like this to share it. And I'm grateful that we're having this webinar just to get the word out, to support each other as we start to create what the future is going to look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you guys have given our audience so much to think about in terms of finding their own North Stars, thinking creatively, thinking about the technology, thinking about their approach and keeping the content fresh and engaging. There's so many pieces of the puzzle. So I want to thank you, Sarah and Dax, for joining me today. Really appreciate you jumping on and having the conversation, and hope we can continue to keep you guys as part of our network. And thank you to everybody that joined us today. And we'll have more episodes of the Institute of Virtual Lunch and Learn series coming up in the coming weeks. Sarah, Dax, thank you again. Appreciate your time.